This year, our theme is undivided hearts, equipped minds, ready feet. And over the last few weeks, we've been looking particularly at the theme of holiness, holy ground, and recognizing that if we are to have undivided hearts, then we need to see God's holiness. And in seeing God's holiness, we need to become like Him, to become holy. And the thing is, we know that and we have that desire, but so often we don't feel like we get there into that holiness that on one level we long for and desire. But there's such good news about God's holiness. Because here's the thing, if God is holy, then He cannot sin. And if God cannot sin, then He cannot sin against you. And if He cannot sin against you, that makes Him the most trustworthy being in your life. And then beyond you and I, if God is holy, then He cannot sin. And if He cannot sin against anyone, which makes Him the ultimate trustworthy being in the universe. But yet the reality is, I think we often have a hard time trusting God. Why else would we have divided hearts? Why else would we live lives that are anything less than fully holy? In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Loki is a god who is always saying, "You should trust me," and proving himself to be utterly untrustworthy. And as soon as people trust him, he turns around and stabs them on the back, literally in some cases, twice where he tricked his brother Thor into trusting him, twice that I can think of anyway. He then went on to stab him. Hardly surprising, because Loki is the god of mischief, not a God that you would trust. But what about the God who is seated on heaven's throne, the only true God who created heaven and earth, who sustains everything, who sustains your life and your next breath, who works everything towards His purposes? Can we trust this God? And this morning, I want to say that God's holiness is a sign that He is trustworthy. And that we really need to see and grab hold of His holiness if we are to fully put our trust in Him. And only when we fully put our trust in Him will we live these lives that we long to live in holiness and in the fullness of life that God calls us into. If God is holy, He can be trusted. So there are two big pillars to understanding what it means to say that God is holy. And the good news with each of these two pillars is that they're both indicators that God is trustworthy in His holiness. So the first one is this: to say that God is holy is to say that He is morally perfect. To say that God is holy is to say that He is morally perfect. A couple of weeks ago, we were looking at Exodus chapter 19, and the people of Israel had come out of Egypt, and God had demonstrated His power with signs and wonders, and He'd seen them safely through the Red Sea, and now they were at Sinai, and and the mountain was quaking, and the trumpet of God was sounding louder and louder, and the smoke billowed all around the mountain, and fire came out of the mountain, and descending on the mountain was God, revealing himself in his holiness. And in this dramatic entrance, what is the first thing that this holy God says to us? It's not, "Hi, how are you? Nice day, isn't it?" His first words were very deliberate, that matched the holiness of God, that showed his moral perfection. So we flip the page from chapter 19 to Exodus 20, and God spoke all these words. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your towns. For 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." And so the holy God reveals himself as holy, as morally perfect. And these words are not just about what we are called to, they also reveal who God is in his holiness. And to get an idea of how much this shows us that God is trustworthy, just consider flipping these words. Imagine if it was the opposite. Imagine if he said, "Yeah, you can have other gods before me." He would have been presenting himself as evil and saying, "Yes, you can have these other gods, the Molechs and the Baals that you sacrifice to, or the gods that you set up for yourself, for your own selfishness that leads you into destruction." Imagine if he hadn't said, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything else. You shall not bow down to it and worship them," and instead said, "Yeah, you can have other idols. You can have other gods. Let's have an open relationship, shall we? Doesn't matter all that much." And then he wouldn't also then be saying that he shows love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. Imagine if he hadn't said, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for he will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name," and instead said, yeah, you can do what you like with my name. There's no ultimate standard. There is nothing that you need to treat as holy, as separate, as different. Imagine if instead of saying, "Yeah, honor the Sabbath day, take a day to rest," if he'd said, "Keep on working. Whatever you do, keep on working," God would reveal himself to be a slave driver. But thank God, that is not who he is, and that is not what he reveals. And he reveals himself to be holy, and what he reveals is good for us, is trustworthy. And you go into the second set of 5 commandments, the second half of the 10 commandments, and there again you see not just a command of what we are to do or not do, but you see who God is. So, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor or your neighbor's spouse or anything your neighbor has. And in God there is no murder, adultery, theft, falsehood, coveting. He is holy, and he invites us to be holy and to discover in his holiness a moral perfection, a trustworthiness. Sinai reveals that God is holy when we are not. And when we resist his law, we resist its goodness, and we show that ultimately we don't trust God, that we don't want to be like him. See, one way that you could describe sin is to say that sin is not believing in God's moral perfection, not believing that God is honest ultimately, so we don't honor him. Now, we probably wouldn't say that directly to God, but our actions often betray our reality. So has anyone seen the famous Will Smith slap this week on the news, or with multiple interesting spins on YouTube or wherever? If you missed it at the Oscars, Chris Rock was making some jokes, some edgy jokes about Will Smith's wife, and Will Smith came up and gave him one almighty slap in front of the cameras. And in his apology statement, when he was handing in his resignation from the Academy, he said, "I am embarrassed, and my actions were not indicative of the man I want to be." And I admire the honesty, actually, of that. Because what you so often hear when people are caught doing something wrong in public life is something that basically says, yeah, I'm sorry about that, I was under stress, and it's not who I really am. The phrase you often hear is, these actions were not congruent with my values. Well, actually, our actions betray our values. Our actions tell us what we really believe. And there's an old lie that we so often believe about God that says that he is not trustworthy, and that is betrayed then in our actions. So the old lie goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, as the serpent pointed out the forbidden fruit to Eve and to her husband Adam. And Eve says, but God says that if we eat of the fruit, we will die. And the serpent says, you will surely not die. And in that moment, Eve chooses to trust the serpent, not God. She sees this potential that if she follows God's will wholeheartedly, that somehow she will be missing out on something good. And so she reaches out and takes a bite, and so does Adam. How you live is proof of what you believe. And if you seek comforts elsewhere than in God and in his good ways, if you seek distraction elsewhere than in God and in his good ways, then you're saying that he cannot be trusted to lead you down good paths. If you choose sin instead of God's ways, you say that he cannot be trusted. If you are half-hearted about following God, if you hedge your bets like an investment manager trying to have a balanced portfolio, if you try to have a balanced portfolio with God, then you reveal that you don't trust him. How we live is the evidence. If his commands show that he is good and holy, then the natural thing to do is to trust him. And where we don't trust him, where we sin, or where we get into things that are distractions or comforts or rabbit runs for our minds that aren't God's good ways, it's because we forget the holiness of God, the moral perfection of God, and the fact that his ways, his moral goodness is the very best path for our lives, the very best path for his created children. And moral perfection by its nature is as God defines it, not as I do or you do. We can't choose the bits that we think are good and right in God's law. Do you know, in every age through history, in every age, there's some aspect of God's morality that society around describes as immorality, and it changes over the ages. I think in our age, it's often where we say that love is God. God is love, but love is not God. And that view that love is God shows itself so often in approaches to sexuality, to identity, to sensuality in the widest sense of the word. Romans 7, verse 12. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. If God is holy, he can't sin. And if he can't sin against you. And if he can't sin against you, he is trustworthy. If God is morally pure, morally perfect, he is trustworthy. And if he is trustworthy, then a morally pure life is good for you and me. The good news is that our God is too holy to deceive. He's too holy to lead you anywhere but to truth. So we have good news that God's holiness is trustworthy. And to say that God is holy is to say, first of all, that he is morally perfect. There's another aspect to God's holiness as well, and that is to say that God is transcendent. In other words, he is above, he is beyond, he is bigger than anything that we can contain or imagine. You see, if our view of holiness is only that he is morally perfect, then we can end up with a kind of legalistic sort of holiness, a kind of pinched view of God that is devoid of awe. In terms of Les Miserables, you might end up a bit more like Javert than Valjean, or in terms of the parable of the prodigal son, more like the elder brother than the father. But God has revealed himself as a transcendently holy God. So, Exodus chapter 19, Moses meets God on the mountain. Exodus chapter 20, God reveals to him his holy law and hands it to Moses. But Moses' very first encounter with God was not with his law, and it was not with his moral perfection. It was with his transcendence. In Exodus, I think it's chapter 3, Moses meets God at a burning bush. He sees this bush, and he's used to seeing bushes out in the wilderness, and he's used to seeing them burning occasionally. But on this occasion, the bush is burning, but it's not burning up. And he goes closer, and he sees there is this flame that is within the bush, but it's not taking for its fuel any of the bush. It is entirely independent of the bush. And that is a picture of God's transcendence, that he is different from us. He is separate from us. He is not in any way dependent on us. We as creatures are dependent in a whole web of ways. God is the only one who is truly independent, and he is free in the fullest sense of that word. And this holy, transcendent God, Moses calls Moses and tells him to go and sets his people free. And he says, "Who shall I say sent me?" And he said, "Say, I am has sent you. I am that I am." And now, at the start of Exodus chapter 20, as God appears, and he says, "I am the Lord your God." And the word for Lord, it's the word that we sometimes translate as Yahweh or Yahweh. It's the what the Jews have long called the ineffable words, the word that is too holy, even to be the name that is too holy to be uttered, to be taken on your lips. So God is transcendent. He is different from us, not to the extent that he is unapproachable and unknowable. He has revealed himself to us, but he is transcendent. He exists differently. And his transcendence is good news for us. His transcendence shows us that he is holy. How? Well, in a few ways. First of all, because God is transcendent, because he exists differently from us, because he is independent, he has no needs. So in Acts chapter 17, we read, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples made by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else." See, if he has no needs, that means he is not needy. And if he's not needy, then he's not dependent on us. He has no angle. Do you know, because I am fallen and sinful and not yet holy as he is holy, do you know, everything I do, everything I say is compromised by calculations of what will be to my advantage. Sometimes I catch myself with these thought patterns, but so much of the time I think I don't even notice the thought patterns. But God is not like that. He has no needs. He is not needy. And in his goodness, he is trustworthy. And he's trustworthy because as a transcendent God, he does not change. Malachi chapter 4, "I, the Lord, do not change." And we can be tempted to think that when our circumstances change, when we go through hard things, that God changes or that God has moved. But if God was to change, he wouldn't be God. I change so often. I change on the basis of whether I'm hungry or cold or tired or irked by what someone has said, or so many things. And that affects my faithfulness, my trustworthiness, but not God. He doesn't change. He is trustworthy. And he's trustworthy because he is not limited like you are. We can trust this transcendently holy God with relief because we don't need to know everything. We don't need to figure out everything. We don't need to be in control of everything because he is the only one who is unlimited. So God, in his holiness, can be trusted. To say that he is holy is to say that he is morally perfect. To say that he is holy is to say that he is transcendent. When you combine these things, you combine his moral perfection and his transcendence, and he has no needs, no angles, he doesn't change, he's not limited, then we find that he is trustworthy because he has again and again proved himself trustworthy. So the start of Exodus 20 again, when this holy, transcendent God reveals his morally perfect law, what is the first thing he says? He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. He's saying, look at what I have done. See that I am trustworthy. There is a long history of trustworthiness. And at times when you are tempted to settle for less, at times when you are tempted to hedge your bets with God, at times when you are tempted to seek comfort outside of God, at times when you are tempted to be overwhelmed by your circumstances and assume that God is not there. Look at his track records and remember God's past faithfulness to trust him for today's battles. And his invitation to you and to me is to be holy as I am holy. To be morally perfect, to be distinct in the world, to be undivided in heart, because we have seen that God is holy, and therefore we see that he is trustworthy.